I woke before the first light touched the courtyard, in that deep gray stillness when the city is more breath than sound. For a few moments I lay on my reed mat, listening to the quiet weight of the air pressing gently against the mud brick walls of my little room. The stone beneath the mat still held the night's coolness, and the faint smell of baked clay and lamp oil lingered from the evening before. Somewhere outside, faint and far away, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Above me, barely visible, the dark lines of the ceiling beam stretched across the room like quiet, unmoving river reeds. I did not hurry to rise. In these few moments before the day began, when the temple complex still dreamed and the city beyond our walls had not yet found its noise, I liked to simply feel the stillness. My breathing was slow, matching the rhythm of that quiet. I could hear nothing of the scribes yet, no scratch of stylus on clay, no hushed conversations near the tablet shelves. The great courtyard would still be empty. The lamps along the main corridor would still be glowing softly, their flames small and steady, like thoughts that had chosen not to sleep. When I finally sat up, the mat rustled softly beneath me. The air in the room was cool against my bare arms. I reached for my simple linen dress, folded neatly beside the mat, and pulled it over my head, tying the belt at my waist with fingers that had already memorized the movement. My hands still held faint traces of yesterday's clay dust in the lines of the skin, no amount of washing ever seemed to remove it completely. It was as if the tablets and the earth that made them wanted to remain with me, even in sleep. I stood and crossed the few steps to the narrow window. It was no more than a slit in the wall, but it was enough to let in the faintest ribbon of air and sky. Outside, the darkness was just beginning to thin. A pale blue touched the edge of the world where the roofs of the city met the fading night. Somewhere beyond those roofs lay the river, its wide body invisible from here but always present in the coolness of the air, in the smell of moisture that slipped through the streets in the early hours. The temple complex lay at the heart of our city, its high walls and stepped towers catching the first light long before the lower buildings did. Inside those walls, the library, or what we called the tablet house, was my world. Rows of clay shelves, carefully shaped and smoothed, stacks of tablets impressed with lines of tiny wedge marks, baskets of fresh, damp clay waiting to be formed, the steady, soft rhythm of styluses pressed against surfaces, like rain falling in a pattern only a few could read. I slipped my feet into simple sandals and opened the door to the corridor. The air outside my room was colder, touched by the breath of the open courtyard. A single oil lamp burned in a niche nearby, its flame curved slightly, leaning toward the unseen wind that slipped through the passageway. The light painted long, soft shadows across the packed earth floor. I walked quietly, my footsteps making almost no sound. As I reached the edge of the small courtyard that belonged to the scribal quarters, I paused. The sky above the rectangular opening was lighter now, a soft blue-gray, and one stubborn star still shone faintly near the highest point. The walls around the courtyard were blank and calm, their mud brick surfaces smoothed by years of sun and occasional rain. A fig tree grew in one corner, its leaves still dark and still in the dawn air. I crossed the courtyard and entered the narrow corridor that led toward the tablet rooms. Here, the smell of clay was stronger, a mix of earth, water, and the faint, smoky scent of past firings. The first tablet room lay to my right, its doorway covered by a simple hanging cloth. I lifted the cloth and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a single small oil lamp set on a low shelf near the center. Its light was gentle, not enough to hurt the eyes after sleep, just enough to reveal outlines. The shelves along the walls kept their silent order, tablets arranged by topic and time, each with its own place in a system that the senior scribes carried in their heads like a second architecture. Tablets on barley rations, temple offerings, trade accounts, hymn collections, star lists, omens observed in the liver of sacrificed animals, all stacked, layered, waiting. For the moment, they needed nothing from me but attention. I went first to the small side room where damp clay was stored. A large basket lined with leaves held a mound of it, still dark with moisture from the well. I pressed my fingers lightly into its surface. It was cool and soft, yielding without collapsing, perfect for new tablets. Beside the basket lay a row of shaped but unwritten pieces, already cut into rectangles and smoothed, waiting for the weight of words. Their surfaces looked as calm as still water. I took one of the prepared tablets and carried it back into the main room, placing it on the low wooden board that served as my writing surface. My stylus, carved from a single piece of reed, lay beside it. I lifted it, feeling again the familiar weight and balance. The tip was still sharp enough from yesterday's work. I turned it lightly between my fingers, the way I always did before beginning, like a scribe's small, private ritual. Outside, somewhere deeper in the temple, a soft sound echoed, a door opening, distant footsteps. The complex was waking. Soon the priest would walk the outer halls, tending to the early rituals. Soon other scribes would arrive, their hushed conversations about accounts and omens and star sightings filling the spaces between shelves. Soon the lamps would be trimmed, their flames fed with oil. But for now, the room belonged only to itself, and to the few breaths of the morning. I did not begin writing yet. Instead, I sat on the low stool and let my hands rest in my lap. I listened to the quiet hum of the building, the almost inaudible creak of wooden supports, the soft settling of clay as the air warmed by a breath, the faintest murmur of wind slipping past the high, narrow window. The city beyond the temple walls remained mostly silent, though a rooster called somewhere, and a donkey brayed once before falling quiet again. On the tablet before me, the smooth clay waited. Today I would be copying a hymn, a long, steady praise to one of our gods who watched over the city and its fields, whose name we spoke often but never carelessly. The original tablet lay on a higher shelf, its surface already hardened from an earlier firing. Yesterday, my teacher had shown it to me, pointing out the places where the signs were old and slightly different, where the language shifted with the memory of a time before my birth. Copy it carefully, he had said, his voice calm but firm. Not like a bird that flies quickly and forgets where it has been, but like the river that moves slowly, remembering every bend. I reached for that original now, lifting it with both hands. It was heavier than the new clay, but not by much. The surface felt cool and slightly rough, the impressed wedges deep and clear. I set it on the tablet stand before me, angled so that the lamplight brushed its surface gently. Then I returned my gaze to the blank clay and lowered the point of the stylus. The first wedge went in easily, a shallow impression near the top edge, angled just so. The second followed, then the third, forming the first sign. I moved slowly, letting my hand think as much as my mind. Each line was a rhythm: press, lift, turn, press, lift, turn. The hymn spoke of dawn and fields and the rise of light over the city's walls. As my hand moved, I felt the world outside the room echo that rise in its own quiet way. Time passed, though not in any way I needed to measure. The lamplight shifted slightly as the oil burned lower. The sky outside the high opening grew brighter, pushing faint fingers of daylight into the room. Somewhere far off, a child's shout echoed briefly, then became part of the day's beginning noises. I was halfway down the tablet when my teacher stepped into the room. He moved quietly, his sandaled feet barely whispering against the floor. His robe was simple, his hair tied back in a low knot. He paused near the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, then approached the table. "How does the hymn look this morning?" he asked softly. "As it did yesterday," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Only the signs are fresher." He came to stand beside me and leaned over the tablet, his shadow falling across part of it. After a moment, he nodded. "Your hand is calmer than last season," he said. "The strokes are more even. You are letting the words sit in the clay instead of pushing them into it." A small warmth rose in my chest at his words. "The clay helps," I said. "It feels kinder today." He smiled at that, just a faint curve at the corners of his mouth. "Clay listens," he said. "But it listens best when you do." He rested his hand briefly on my shoulder, then moved on to the shelves, checking a row of tablets that had been reorganized the day before. I lowered my eyes again and returned to the hymn. The rhythm continued, press, lift, turn, press, lift, turn, until the lines near the bottom of the tablet began to fill. By the time I finished and set the stylus down, the lamplight was hardly needed. The room had filled with a soft, diffuse glow from the window. I lifted the tablet carefully, keeping my fingers along the edges, and carried it to a low shelf where damp tablets rested to dry. Their surfaces reflected the light in a dull sheen. The words, for now, were still easily changeable, but soon they would grip the clay more firmly, becoming part of it. I stepped back and let my gaze run along the rows of drying tablets. On each, someone's hand had left a pattern of thought, a trace of a day's work. Accounts of barley, agreements between merchants, shrine inventories, fragments of stories, lists of stars seen on clear nights, prayers whispered and then impressed for remembrance. All of them rested here, leaning slightly against one another, like people sleeping shoulder to shoulder in a crowded but peaceful room. Outside, the temple complex had fully awakened. Footsteps moved steadily along the main corridors. The low murmur of priests' voices rose near the central courtyard. The scent of bread, baking somewhere in the lower kitchens, drifted faintly into the tablet room, easing itself between the smells of clay and lamp oil. I straightened my back and rolled my shoulders once. A small ache had begun to form between them, but it was a familiar ache, not unpleasant, more like the body's quiet reminder that it was part of the work, too. For a little while, I simply stood in the middle of the room, feeling the gentle weight of the morning settle into its proper place. There were more tasks ahead, more tablets to copy, inventories to check, lists to update. The day would unfold in calm, measured steps, like the lines of characters on the clay. But for this moment, there was only the soft light, the smell of warm earth, and the silent companionship of the shelves around me. When my teacher called my name from the doorway, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "There will be a delivery from the outer storehouses before midday," he said. "New records. We will need space." I nodded, already glancing at the shelves, thinking of where new tablets might rest without disturbing the old order. "I will make room," I answered. "Do it slowly," he replied. "Nothing in this house likes to be pushed aside in haste." And as he turned away, I smiled to myself, feeling again that quiet satisfaction that came from knowing my days would be spent here, in the company of clay, light, and words that moved more slowly than the river, but were just as patient. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to send a square of bright light across the floor near the doorway, the tablet room had grown warmer. The coolness of early morning had slipped away, replaced by a gentle, dry heat that seemed to rise slowly from the clay walls and the packed earth floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the shaft of sunlight, turning in tiny circles before drifting out of sight. The sounds from the temple's main courtyard had become a steady background murmur, footsteps passing, voices speaking in low tones, the occasional, distant call of someone crossing the open space. I moved along the shelves, my fingers hovering just above the tablets without touching them. The arrangement here had its own logic, one I had been learning since I first came to the tablet house as a younger apprentice. Hymns and prayers along one wall, arranged by deity and by season, administrative records along another, lined up in the order of their creation, astronomical notes and omen collections stored on higher shelves, not because they were more important, but because they were consulted less often and could afford to be a little farther from reach. There was a steady comfort in this order. The shelves, the tablets, the spaces between them, they all held the feeling of having been thought about carefully, not hurriedly. As I looked for places to clear for the incoming delivery, I kept my movements slow, lifting stacks only when necessary, shifting them by a hand's width, then stepping back to see how they fit in the space. I knew my teacher would notice if something was out of place, not because he was strict for its own sake, but because he believed the arrangement of the tablets reflected the arrangement of our thoughts. I had just finished clearing a low shelf near the door when I heard footsteps in the outer corridor, several pairs together, measured but slightly heavier than usual. A moment later, the hanging cloth at the entrance stirred, and two younger temple workers entered, each carrying a shallow wooden tray laden with tablets. Behind them came an older man, one of the storehouse scribes, his arms folded loosely in front of him. The two workers moved carefully, the tablets clinking softly against one another as they set the trays down on the floor. The older scribe inclined his head toward me in greeting. "These are from the northern granary," he said, his voice even, unhurried. "Inventories from the last 3 months, and adjustments for the new season." I bowed slightly, then looked down at the tablets. Their surfaces were fully dry, the wedge marks deep and precise. A bit of pale dust clung to their edges, as if they had been resting on shelves that did not see as many visitors as ours. "Thank you," I replied. "We have space set aside for them." He nodded, taking a moment to glance around the room. His eyes lingered on the shelves and the baskets of clay, the single lamp, the open window high above. "I always like the smell in here," he said quietly. "The storehouses have their own scent, grain and fiber and people. But here, it smells like thought." The observation made me smile, though I did so only inwardly. "We will catalog them by day's end," I said. "Whenever the tablets are ready," he replied with a small gesture of his hand. "The grain will not vanish between now and sunset." The two workers bowed once more and left with him, the fabric of the doorway swaying gently in their wake. For a moment the room felt a little more full, not only with the presence of the new tablets, but with the faint echo of their footsteps. I knelt beside the trays and began examining the tablets one by one. Each had a short line of text along its edge, a brief mark indicating its place among others, the granary name, the season, the number in a sequence. The main surfaces were densely filled with careful writing, lists of measures, names of overseers, tallies of incoming carts and outgoing loads. The clay used for them was slightly lighter in color than the one we favored in the temple, but it had taken the impressions well. As I worked, my teacher entered and stood close enough for me to sense his shadow before I looked up. "These are the new arrivals," I said. "Yes," he answered. "Place them below the older grain records. The year will not be complete without them." We moved together now, in a familiar rhythm. I passed him each tablet in turn. He glanced at the writing, his eyes moving quickly along the edge, then handed it back to me. I placed each one in its new resting place, aligned with the others. The sound of clay touching clay was soft, almost like the sound of dry leaves brushing together in a light wind. After a while, the trays were empty and the shelf was full. I sat back on my heels and wiped a faint line of clay dust from my hands onto my linen belt. "They fit well," my teacher said. "They will be read often?" I asked. "Not all of them," he said. "But each one may be needed at some moment. And they will be ready when that moment comes." He left then to attend to other matters, and the room was quiet again. I stood slowly, feeling the muscles in my legs stretch after kneeling so long. A thin line of sunlight had advanced farther across the floor. It now touched the base of one of the lower shelves, turning the edge of a tablet a warmer color. Soon it would be time for the midday meal. Before leaving the tablet house, I walked to the doorway and lifted the hanging cloth just enough to let in more light. The whiter beam illuminated the room without harshness. The clay shelves, the neat rows of tablets, the unused writing board, all seemed to breathe more easily in the brighter glow. Crossing the courtyard toward the dining hall, I felt the sun warm my shoulders. The sky overhead was clear, a pale blue that deepened near the horizon. The higher temple structures caught the light, their edges sharp and bright. In the distance, beyond the complex walls, the city had fully awakened, more voices, more footsteps, the occasional bleat of a goat, the faint ring of a hammer from some workshop. The dining hall was a long, simple room with low benches along either side and a narrow central walkway. Clay bowls had been set out on low tables. The usual midday food awaited us: coarse bread, lentils cooked with onions, a small portion of dates or figs. The smell of it was warm and grounding. We ate mostly in silence, as was our habit, sometimes not from any strict rule, but because the quiet seemed to accompany the food well. The clink of bowls, the sound of bread tearing, the soft sigh of someone settling into a more comfortable position, these small noises formed a gentle pattern. As I ate, my thoughts drifted back to the tablet room. The feeling stayed with me of the shelves now holding more than they had at sunrise, the slight shift in their balanced weight, the promise that the new arrivals would one day be read by eyes not yet born. When the meal ended, we carried our bowls to be washed and then stepped out into the temple's outer courtyard. The sun shone directly into the open space now, and the floor radiated a dry warmth. A few others found shade beneath the narrow overhangs or sat on the steps leading to the higher levels, their bodies bent slightly in rest. I walked slowly along the edge of the courtyard toward a smaller passage that led to the outer terrace. This terrace overlooked a section of the city and, beyond it, a faint line where the river curved. From here, the sounds of daily life were more blended, less distinct. The marketplace was too far away to see clearly, but the rise and fall of its movements reached us as a kind of distant, pulsing hum. I rested my hands on the low wall of the terrace and looked outward. Mud brick houses clustered together, their flat roofs forming a pattern of rectangles. Smoke rose in thin threads from some of them. The air above the streets shimmered faintly. Farther out, a patch of fields lay in organized stripes, their colors muted under the midday sun. Beyond them, the water of the river caught the light in small bright flashes, just enough to mark its presence. Standing there, I felt a quiet connection between what I had just touched with my hands and what I saw before me. The grain tablets from the northern storehouses, the scribbled records of carts and measures, the rough numbers pressed into clay, they all pointed, in one way or another, to these fields, these houses, these lives. The tablet house felt both separate from this world and deeply tied to it. After a time, when the stillness began to feel heavy on my shoulders, I turned and walked back into the shade of the inner corridors. The tablet house awaited its afternoon work. The light inside the tablet room had shifted when I returned. The bright square on the floor had migrated toward the opposite wall and begun to shorten. I lit the small oil lamp again, not because it was dark, but because its warm, steady glow created a kind of center for the room. My next task was to check a series of older tablets that had been requested by one of the temple priests. He wished to compare a recent omen reading with those recorded in earlier years. The tablets he needed were kept on a shelf near the back, where the less frequently handled texts rested. I moved slowly along that shelf now, reading the brief edge inscriptions. The years might not mean much to someone outside this building, but to us they formed a kind of thin invisible line through time, a way of knowing not only what had been said, but when it had occurred. My fingers hovered near the wedges, tracing the spaces between them. At last I found the ones I sought, a small group of tablets with similar markings, each from a different year but all concerning the same type of sign. I lifted them gently, one by one, and carried them to the low table near the lamp. Here, with the soft light reaching across their surfaces, I could see details that would be lost in the shadow. The signs were slightly shallower than those on newer tablets. The hands that had made them belonged to scribes who might no longer walk these halls. Their styles were different, some lines more angular, others more flowing, but the language remained familiar. I arranged them in order and made a few notes on a small practice tablet, reference marks, short reminders of which omen belonged to which year, brief descriptions of the celestial events they recorded. The act of copying only fragments, and in a shorthand used only for transfers like this, felt strangely light compared to the full copying of a hymn. But it had its own rhythm, glance, note, glance again. The afternoon wore on. The room grew a little warmer again, then slowly began to cool as the heat of the day reached its peak and started to soften. Outside the high window, the color of the sky shifted from bright to more muted shades. A faint breeze slipped through the opening, carrying with it the distant smell of river water and dust. At some point, my teacher returned to the room and watched me work for a few breaths. Then he turned to a shelf near the door and picked up a tablet of his own, the one he kept for personal notes. He seated himself in the corner, where he could see both the shelves and the writing board. The scratch of his stylus joined the quiet sounds in the room. We did not speak for a long time. There was no need. The presence of another person working nearby did not disturb the stillness, if anything, it deepened it. Each of us moved at our own slow pace, our thoughts sinking like water into clay and leaving marks that would remain long after we had left the room. Eventually, the light grew softer and the corners of the tablet house darkened. The day began to lean toward evening. The distant noises of the temple changed their character, the energy of activity shifted toward the quieter patterns of preparation for night. My teacher set down his stylus and stretched his back. "Enough for today," he said quietly. "The tablets will remain. They always do." I nodded, feeling the stiffness in my own shoulders and neck. I stacked the omen tablets neatly and placed them in a shallow wooden tray for the priest to collect. Then I extinguished the lamp, leaving the room lit only by the last of the daylight. As I stepped into the corridor, the air felt cooler on my skin. The shadows along the walls had thickened. In the courtyard, a few monks and temple workers moved with slower steps, their bodies beginning to carry the day's fatigue. Someone passed carrying a small basket of charcoal toward the upper levels, no doubt preparing the lamps that would soon be lit. I walked toward the outer courtyard again, drawn, as I often was at this hour, toward the open sky. The sun was low now, its light stretched long and soft across the bricks. The sky had begun to deepen into richer shades, a gentle wash of gold at the horizon fading upward into pale blue. On an impulse, I continued past the temple walls and into the small lane that led toward the river. The temple gates were open to those who worked within, and this close to sunset, the streets were quieter. The heat had loosened its grip, and a faint breeze moved between the houses. It was not a long walk to the riverbank. As I approached it, the smell of wet earth and water grew stronger. The sounds changed too. The city's hum fell behind me, replaced by the soft, continuous rush of the river's movement. When I stepped out onto the packed earth near the water's edge, the sky was reflected in the broad, slow surface in muted colors. The river was wide here, its far bank lined with low trees and patches of grass. A few small boats drifted near the shore, their hulls rocking gently. Children played near the water, their voices bright but not loud, carrying across in short bursts. A group of women knelt near the edge, washing cloths in steady, practiced motions. I found a flat stone near the bank and sat down, drawing my legs close. The ground still held some of the day's warmth, but the air above it was cool. The water carried bits of reed and leaf and other small debris, all moving in the same wide direction, as if following a path they did not need to see. For a while, I simply watched. The rhythm of the river felt different from the rhythm of the tablet house, but the two did not conflict. One flowed, one stayed, one moved without leaving a visible trace, the other held marks that did not move at all. Yet both told stories, of fields and storms, of people and seasons, of decisions and prayers. I wondered, not for the first time, how many of the tablets we stored would one day be forgotten, their words no longer read, their wedge marks worn down by time or buried by accident. And yet, even that thought did not bring any sadness. It was simply another movement in a cycle I could not see all of. When the sun finally slid below the horizon, the colors in the sky faded to softer tones. A pale, early evening light stayed for a few breaths longer before yielding to deeper blue. I rose from the stone and walked back toward the temple, my steps slow but steady. The lamps had been lit by the time I returned. Their golden light glowed from niches in the walls, casting gentle shadows. The evening recitation would begin soon. I entered the courtyard and took my place among the others, folding my legs beneath me, feeling the cool stone beneath the thin fabric of my dress. As the first notes of the chant rose, I let my mind rest on the sound, on the memory of the river's movement, on the feeling of clay under my fingers. The day, with all its small details and tasks, seemed to gather itself into a shape that did not need words. When later that night I lay again on my reed mat, the faint smell of clay still in the lines of my hands, I felt the quiet of the tablet house and the steady flow of the river both moving gently somewhere inside me. My breathing slowed. The darkness of the room felt soft, not empty. And as sleep came, gradually, like light at dawn, I found myself thinking not of any single tablet, or any particular word, but of the steady, patient work that waited for me in the morning. Work that did not rush, did not shout, but simply continued, line after line, day after day, like the river itself moving past the walls of the city, never needing to explain where it was going. The next day began with a deeper quiet than usual, as though the city itself had decided to wake more slowly. Even before the first light reached the courtyard, I sensed a stillness in the air, a coolness that suggested the night had clung a little longer to the clay walls and the stone floors. When I opened my eyes, the room was filled with the faintest gray. My breathing sounded louder than usual in the early hush. For a moment, I lay motionless, feeling the smooth weave of the reed mat beneath me and the gentle heaviness in my limbs that belonged to mornings after long, concentrated work. Slowly, I sat up. The robe I wore was cool when I pulled it around my shoulders, touched by the night that lingered inside the room. I tied the belt at my waist, smoothed the wrinkles, and moved toward the narrow window. Outside, the sky held a softness that was almost silver. No birds called yet, though they always would when the sun rose fully. No market noise drifted this far. Only the faintest hum of life stirred somewhere in the distance, too distant to identify, close enough to be felt. When I opened the door, the corridor smelled faintly of oil and dust, the familiar scent of these walls. A single lamp, kept alight through the night, burned low in its niche. Its flame flickered but did not waver, glowing like a small star against the clay surface. The shadows it cast moved gently, softened by the early light beginning to press through. I walked with slow steps toward the courtyard. The air brushed lightly across my cheeks, cool and calming. The courtyard itself felt broader in the dim morning, its corners hidden in shadow and its center quietly waiting for the day. A few other scribes and novices entered behind me, their footsteps no louder than mine. When the bell rang, it sounded round and full, its echo drifting above the walls, disappearing slowly into the sky not yet touched by full daylight. We took our places along the inner edge of the courtyard. The abbot arrived, as he always did, with a pace that felt neither fast nor slow, but simply correct. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and the courtyard settled into a deeper quiet. My mind softened its edges, thoughts drifting like smoke dissolving into air. I breathed gently. The world brightened behind my closed lids. When the abbot ended the meditation, his voice was soft enough that it seemed part of the morning itself. "Today will be warm," he said. "Work at a pace that suits the heat, and let the clay speak before you answer it." He left with the same quiet certainty with which he had arrived. We rose slowly, each of us moving into our duties for the day. As I walked toward the tablet room, the sun's first true light touched the edge of the corridor. It glowed warm gold along the floor and brought with it the scent of the outer air, damp earth, grain dust from the granaries, the faint sweetness of date palms carried on the breeze. Inside the tablet house, the coolness remained. It always did in the mornings, as if the clay itself held the memory of night. I lit a small lamp, trimmed the wick, and placed it near the writing board, careful not to let the flame touch the edges of any tablet. The light settled into the corners of the room, gentle and steady. My first task was to finish organizing the omen tablets from the day before. I lifted the tray with both hands and carried it to the back shelf where they belonged. The edges of the older tablets were worn smooth from years of being held. Their wedge marks, though still clear, had softened slightly. I placed each one in its space, feeling a small sense of completion in the way the shelf once again held a full, ordered set. After that, I rolled out a fresh piece of damp clay from the covered basket. The smell of it rose softly, earthy, cool, and grounding. I placed it on the wooden board and began cutting it into the familiar rectangular shape using a flat reed. The clay yielded easily. The edges formed clean lines beneath my fingers. Before writing anything, I smoothed the surface with a small piece of polished stone. The action was slow, repetitive, calming. The clay shone slightly when it was ready, inviting the first marks. My teacher walked in then. He paused near the doorway, observing without speaking, then came to stand at my side. "You will copy a record of offerings today," he said. "One of the priests will take the duplicate to the shrine in the western quarter." I nodded. "Are the originals on the high shelf?" Yes, he replied. The ones marked by the green edge. I went to the shelf and found the tablets easily. The green pigment painted along their edges had faded over time but remained clear enough to see. I carried the top tablet back to the writing board. The offering record was brief, a list of barley amounts, small quantities of woven cloth, and 2 goats promised during the previous moon. But each sign had to be made carefully, each number marked exactly. These records did not tolerate changes. The stylus pressed into the clay with a familiar sound, a soft, crisp indentation, as though the clay were sighing. I wrote slowly, not hurried by the fact that the text was short. My teacher had always told me that the short tablets required the greatest patience, there was no room to hide mistakes. Outside the tablet house, the temple grounds grew busier. Footsteps passed the doorway, voices rose and fell. I could hear someone sweeping the courtyard stones in long, even strokes. A pot being set on the ground. A wooden bucket carried from one place to another. All these sounds formed a background rhythm, steady, patient, without rush. By the time I finished the offering tablet and set it aside to dry, the sunlight had reached the high window. A thin beam touched the opposite wall, creating a pale stripe of brightness that slowly lengthened as the sun climbed. My teacher inspected the new tablet, nodded once, and took it to the shelf where it would sit until fully hardened. Good, he said. The signs flow. His praise was never loud, but it always settled quietly inside me. Before midday, 2 more tablets arrived, one from the scribes working in the granary courtyard, and another from the astrologers. The granary report was straightforward, but the astrologer's tablet was filled with delicate wedge marks describing the previous night's star movement. I held it carefully, letting my eyes follow the lines. Even if I could not yet interpret every sign, I admired the precision of the hand that made them. These will wait, my teacher said. After we eat. When he left the room, I remained a moment longer, placing my hand near the clay but not touching it. The quiet of the tablet house wrapped gently around me again. The room felt like the inside of a shell, the outside world muted, softened, made distant. When the bell called for the midday meal, I extinguished the lamp and stepped into the sunlit corridor. Heat pressed lightly against my face. In the courtyard, the light was bright and full, the shadows were smaller. The fragrance of food wafted through the air, lentils with garlic, bread still warm from the hearth, onions cooked until soft. We ate in silence, as always. When the meal ended, I washed my bowl and took a short walk through the outer courtyard. The sun was high now, the air filled with the dry, warm scent of baked clay. A few temple workers rested under a shaded overhang. A child ran past carrying a small basket, laughing once before disappearing around a corner. The afternoon returned me to the tablet house. My teacher handed me one of the new tablets. This one needs a duplicate, he said. Tomorrow someone will take the copy to the palace official in charge of the northern fields. The tablet was filled with details, rows of signs marking field boundaries, canal measurements, yields from the previous season. It was not a simple transcription. It required attention, patience, breath. I prepared another smooth piece of clay and seated myself on the low stool. Then, with slow care, I began copying the first line. The stylus marked the clay in its gentle rhythm. Press, lift, turn. Press, lift, turn. Outside the doorway, the day moved on. Voices rose and softened. A pot clattered in the kitchen. A donkey brayed somewhere beyond the walls. The river wind came and went, carrying with it faint hints of water and distant fields. The sunlight through the window shifted gradually, moving across the room in a long arc. My hands grew a little tired, my shoulders slightly heavy, but the work itself held me calmly. Each sign took form. Each line settled into place. When the shadows grew long and the air inside the tablet house cooled again, I finished the last line on the tablet. I placed my stylus down and exhaled slowly. The duplicate was complete. My teacher returned then, his steps quiet as always. He examined the tablet, running a finger lightly above the surface, not touching the clay, but sensing its balance. After a moment, he nodded. "It is good," he said simply. He placed the tablet on a drying shelf and then gestured toward the doorway. The evening calls. As we stepped into the courtyard, the sky above us had deepened into gentle colors, pale gold near the horizon, then soft rose, then deeper blue. The air was cooler, touched by the coming night. Lamps had been lit along the walls, their flames flickering in small, steady motions. The chant began shortly after. We sat together, letting our voices fall into the slow pattern learned since childhood, though some voices were younger, some older, all sounded gentle in the evening light. The courtyard held its own kind of hush. The lamp flames bent slightly in the breeze. The scent of cooling earth rose from the stones beneath us. The sky above grew darker, revealing early stars. When the chant ended, the abbot spoke only a few words. "The day has shaped you. Let the night soften what remains." I felt those words settle deep inside me. Later, as I walked back to my room, the corridor lights flickered against the walls. Night air flowed gently through the passageway. My hands still carried the faint scent of clay. When I lay down on my mat, the world felt quiet, complete. And as I drifted toward sleep, the last thought I had was not a thought at all, only the lingering rhythm of the stylus and the soft, patient breath of the tablet house wrapping itself around my dreams. The morning that followed arrived with a warmth that had not been there the previous days, as if the sun had climbed the sky more confidently, carrying the breath of the approaching dry season. Before I opened my eyes, I felt the gentle heat touching the upper part of the wall, a slow spreading glow that eased its way across the surface. The air inside my small room was still cool enough to be pleasant, but it held a suggestion of the heaviness that would come later in the day. I rose slowly, letting my body wake at its own pace. My hands felt the familiar grain of the reed mat beneath them. The clay dust that lingered in the creases of my fingers caught the light faintly when I tied the belt of my robe. Outside the narrow window, the sky was already pale, leaning toward gold at the edges. No mist softened it today. The world seemed clearer, perhaps a little sharper. When I stepped into the corridor, the smell of lamp oil greeted me first, then the gentle warmth of the clay walls. The single lamp still burned low, its flame lifting slightly whenever a breeze found its way through the passage. The shadows along the floor were softer now, touched by the early light creeping in from the courtyard. The first bell sounded, its tone round and steady. I walked with the others into the courtyard, where the morning air held a delicate balance between coolness and warmth. The walls of the courtyard seemed almost to glow in the early light. A bird perched on the branch of the fig tree, watching us with calm eyes before fluttering away when the second bell rang. We sat. The abbot arrived moments later. His steps were slow, unhurried, as though he was giving the morning a chance to settle around him. When he closed his eyes, the courtyard descended once again into that familiar stillness, a stillness that stretched wide enough to hold every thought without needing to grasp any of them. I breathed deeply. The air tasted faintly of baked clay and distant water. My mind drifted, not far, just lightly, moving through the memory of the previous day, through the softness of the evening chant, through the quiet satisfaction of completing the duplicate tablet. When the abbot opened his eyes again, he did so gently, like someone lifting a curtain to let in morning light. His voice was soft. Today you will finish something. And you will begin something else. He said nothing more. He rarely explained his statements. They were simply small stones dropped into the river of the day, each sending out ripples in its own time. After meditation, I walked toward the tablet room, feeling the warm air brush against my arms. The sun had risen enough to illuminate the doorway, turning the hanging cloth a muted gold where the light touched it. When I lifted the cloth, the inside of the room looked calmer than usual, as though it had been waiting for me. I lit the lamp by habit, though I did not fully need it. Its glow created a point of warmth, a center for the room. The shelves around me seemed to stretch farther in the brighter light. Every tablet looked a little clearer, its edges more defined, its wedge marks crisp. My teacher entered soon after. He carried a small wooden box, and when he placed it on the writing board, it made almost no sound. I looked at it curiously, then at him. "You will begin a new hymn today," he said. "One that the priests wish copied for the shrine in the western quarter. The old version has become cracked with time." He opened the box. Inside lay the older tablet, a single piece of clay, slightly curved at the edges, its surface darkened by age. The signs on it were faint in places, not from carelessness but from the slow erosion of many years. I lifted it carefully with both hands. It felt heavier than I expected, as though it held both words and time. "The hymn is familiar," he said. "But do not trust familiarity. Follow every line." I nodded. "I will." He gestured to the basket of fresh clay. "Prepare your tablet. Let the clay be smooth." When he left the room, I sat for a long moment, holding the old tablet in the light of the lamp. The wedge marks ran in straight, confident lines, though some of them had softened into shallow impressions. Whoever had written it had done so with a steady hand and a calm mind. I wondered briefly who they had been, how many mornings they had sat like this, copying words that had existed long before either of us was born. Finally, I set the old tablet on its stand and began smoothing the new clay. The stone I used was cool, and each movement of my hand created a soft, sliding sound that filled the stillness of the room. When the surface was ready, flat, even, almost shining, I lifted the stylus and lowered its tip to the clay. The first sign came slowly. Then the second. My hand found its rhythm, a quiet, steady movement. Press, lift, turn. Press, lift, turn. The hymn spoke of offerings of water, of the rising sun, of the gods' protection over fields and families. Each sign seemed to carry a breath of the morning with it. Outside, the temple grew louder as the day unfolded. Pots clattered, footsteps crossed the corridors, workers called to one another in low voices as they carried baskets toward the granaries. A warm breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the dry scent of the coming season. I worked without hurry. The sun rose higher. The room brightened. My hands grew warm from the clay, but the rhythm never faltered. When the offering lines were complete, I paused, stretching my shoulders. A long sliver of sunlight now lay across the floor, reaching toward the shelves. Just before midday, my teacher returned. He approached quietly and stood behind me, watching for a few breaths. Then he said, "You have steadiness today. It is a calm day, I replied. He nodded. The clay listens to that. He examined the tablet, his eyes lingering on the lines I had written. Finally, he said, after we eat, you will finish the last verses. Then we will prepare it for drying. The midday meal was simple: bread, lentils, onions, and a few slices of date. The courtyard was bright, filled with soft, moving shadows as people passed in and out of the open corridors. I ate slowly, letting the warmth of the food settle gently in my stomach. When the meal ended, I returned immediately to the tablet house. The room welcomed me with its familiar coolness. The lamp's flame flickered slightly when I passed it, as though acknowledging my return. The last verses of the hymn required a different kind of attention. The signs were arranged more compactly, the words older, the phrases more poetic. I slowed my hand. Press, lift, turn. Press, lift, turn. The clay accepted each mark, holding it with patient firmness. As the afternoon heat deepened, the light in the room took on a softer, more golden hue. Dust drifted lazily through the window's beam, moving in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The scent of warm earth grew stronger. When I pressed the final sign into the clay, I set the stylus down and exhaled quietly. The tablet felt complete, not rushed, not forced, but shaped in a steady rhythm that matched the quiet of the day. My teacher arrived soon after. He lifted the tablet carefully, turning it in the light. The signs caught the glow, each one clear and even. It will dry well, he said. You may carry it to the shelf. I did so slowly, placing it beside the others. Its damp surface reflected a faint shimmer, as though it still held some breath of the morning. As I stepped back, a strange feeling washed over me, neither sadness nor joy, but a gentle recognition that something had ended. The hymn was complete. The day's work had settled into the clay. The river outside the temple walls would continue moving, indifferent to whether a tablet had been written or not, yet somehow connected to the quiet rhythm of the tablet house. My teacher called my name. I turned to him. Tomorrow, he said, you will begin a new set of star lists. The month turns soon, and the sky must be recorded. His words settled into me like soft clay filling a carved mark. Another task. Another day. Another rhythm. Evening arrived with its usual calm. Lamps were lit along the corridors. The courtyard glowed in the warm, trembling light of oil flames. We gathered for the chant, our voices rising softly in the dusk. The heat of the afternoon faded into a comforting warmth, and the scent of earth grew cooler. After the chant ended, I walked alone toward the outer terrace. The sky was deep blue now, streaked with faint color near the horizon. A thin crescent moon hung low. The city below had softened into patches of shadow and pale glow. The river reflected the fading light with slow, steady movements. I rested my hands on the terrace wall. The air felt gentle against my skin. The day's tension had dissolved. My breath was slow, deep, matching the quiet movement of the world. When I eventually returned to my room, the corridor was dim. Lamps flickered. The night held warmth from the day, but a cool breeze drifted in from the far end of the hall. My mat felt familiar beneath me, grounding. I lay down, pulling the robe lightly around my shoulders. The clay under my fingernails felt like a reminder, not of work, but of belonging. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river moved with its unchanging patience. Somewhere above, the stars that awaited my recording tomorrow began their slow rise. My eyes grew heavy. The darkness softened. The sounds of night, the faint rustle of wind, the far-off call of a bird settling into its nest, the echo of footsteps fading down a corridor, gathered around me. And sleep came, gently, steadily, like a tablet being placed on a shelf, settled, quiet, complete.